While more audience participants are entering the room, let's start the discussion. Good evening, good morning. Welcome to the event co-organized by the Environmental Research Center at Duke Kunshan University and the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. My name is Junjie Zhang. I'm director of the Environmental Research Center and the National Master of Environmental Policy
Center. Thank you to all of our audience members for joining, and particular thanks to our panel members. We are at an inflection point in China's climate change policy. The targets that President Xi announced at the UN General Assembly in September of this year, which Junjie just mentioned, for carbon neutrality by 2060, and moving up the range of time at which it would peak carbon emissions to prior to 2030, are an important moment. As we'll soon hear, this is not the first inflection point we've seen in this policy space, and it certainly won't be the last. As the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases by a significant margin, the challenge here is enormous. I don't wish to take any more of the panel's time in framing the discussion today, which Junjie has so ably done. So I want to go ahead and dive in. And I'm going to begin with my friend and colleague, Barbara Fenimore, Senior Strategic Director for Asia and founder of the China program at the NRDC. Barbara, you've been quite vocal about the fact that climate change has received scientific and policy attention for decades in China, and that's something that you saw up close and detailed in your recent book, Will China Save the Planet? Given that context, did President Xi's announcement at the General Assembly surprise you? And do you see it as an evolution of Chinese climate policy, or as a recalibration or a reset? Please take it away.
So good to see you again, Jackson, and to be with my distinguished co-panelists and friends. And thank you all for joining us today from around the world. Yes, Jackson, what a lot of people don't realize is that shortly after the IPCC asked if it's, you asked, is it an evolution? Or is it a recalibration? I think it's really a step change. It's really a step change in China's response. Just look at their current targets. China pledged to peak 2030 CO2 emissions by around 2030. Well, there's no real indication, no firm date. Some Chinese experts have said that 2035 would be okay. But even more important, there was no limit on what that peak would be. And no indication of what would happen after the peak would reach. So that left open the door for China to continue CO2 emissions at a very high peak level indefinitely. So this is a true step change, a massive change. It's also China's first absolute target, but also its first long-term target and its first unilateral target. So these are all remarkable changes.
Thank you, Barbara. You really anticipated my next question. And you have begun to describe the energy and climate paradox in China, which I think is really at the heart of our conversation. This is something I've recently written about, and I want to quote some of your words back to you, or really paraphrase, I should say, to put a bit more meat on the bones of what you were just discussing, and then ask you to go a little further on what you just introduced on targets. You wrote that China burns half the world's coal and is still building new coal plants, though they are increasingly uneconomic and unnecessary. It burns coal directly in factories, produces half the world's steel and cement. It's gone from streets filled with bicycles to the world's largest global automotive market and importer of oil. But China is also by far the largest investor, producer, and consumer and of targets. It's been interesting to me to watch the renewable penetration and deployment targets from the 12th and 13th five-year plans be exceeded rapidly. And so I wonder if for the 14th five-year plan, we'll see more of a certain degree of under-promise, over-deliver, or perhaps that's a cynical position, and that those targets were viewed as being strong at the moment, and the industry just accelerated more quickly than Chinese planning authorities foresaw. And also, the targets that have guided Chinese climate policy for so many years have, as you've mentioned, been efficiency based, including the peaking target, really, which doesn't give us that hard cap, just gives us a year at which we'll see that downward shift begin. But there have been sneaky hard caps that have fit inside of that policy apparatus. The 1,000 enterprises and 10,000 enterprises programs come to mind, where many of the largest industries and companies in China do face some kind of hard cap, and they face the command and control and market measures beneath that. And the coal equivalency cap in the 13th five-year plan, really perhaps a paradigm shift in moving from efficiency to hard caps. So that's all a lead up to the question about something that you said that really perked me up. You said an absolute CO2 cap in the 14th five-year plan would be a great thing to see. I completely agree. And I think that we will see those strong renewable targets that you mentioned as well. I wonder, how do you handicap the likelihood of an absolute CO2 cap in the 14th five-year plan? How likely do you see it?
A lot of Chinese researchers are calling for this. President Xi indicated that China will upgrade its Paris climate pledge to peak its CO2 emissions before 2030. We think it could, in fact, reach it by 2025. So I think in order to get, let's not forget that China has not officially placed its 2060 carbon neutral pledge or even officially upgraded its 2030 Paris pledges, which call for 20% non-fossil energy by 2030. So once it does that, if it does that, that opens the way for these targets in the 14th five-year plan. Otherwise, they may be hesitant to get ahead of their official Paris pledges.
Thanks. That's a really good point, and an excellent thing to bring up on the intersection between Chinese domestic and international foreign policy, something that David's going to pick up on later in the panel. But before we get to David, I want to say thank you to Barbara and transition to our colleague Hu Min, the executive director for the Innovation and Green Development Program, who's joining us from Beijing here today. Hu Min, you are particularly well placed to discuss two different issues that I want us to shift to now. One is about the impetuses for these climate announcements, which you have recently written, I think aptly, are not all about climate. You've stated that a primary reason behind China's increased climate ambition is to develop, I'm quoting here, a high quality economy driven by technical innovation. So to what extent do you see these recent climate targets and those which Barbara has just mentioned we will see in the future as a signal of President Xi's intention to use climate, or at least operate in tandem with climate targets, to drive a structural economic and social transformation in China, to grab higher value parts of the global economic value chain, to become a leader in the nascent sources of energy and transportation into the future, and to abate conventional pollution along the way. So what's really driving these decisions, and where does climate fit in and perhaps not fit in?
Thank you, Professor Arvin. Thank you, Jackson. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'm so happy to see all the friends, and I agree with all Barbara's comments that she just made. Actually, her comments answered part of your question already, I think. Yes, it's very obvious to me that it's not only for the international climate commitment, but it's more of a domestic strategy, long-term vision. And it's very clear and strong signal from the leadership of China. So if we go back to President Xi's speech at the UN conference, he said, after mentioning China's carbon neutrality goal and the Peking goal, he actually continued as he said, we call on all countries to pursue innovative, coordinated, green and open development for all, to seize the historic opportunity presented by the new round of scientific and technological revolution and industrial transformation to achieve a green recovery of the world economy. In the complicated geopolitical context that other people also mentioned, there is a stronger competition and it's in the international market, and China needs to look for the new development engine. And this green growth concept
divergent really come together and collapse as the 2000s and 2010s have moved forward, which is very interesting. I want to ask you in a moment about technology and what the particularly promising pathways forward are for decarbonization in your mind, given your work at IGDP. But before I do that, I do want to latch on to something that you mentioned. You know, you clearly have pointed out that China is in a new era of development, and I like your language around a green engine for growth. And that, of course, predates the global pandemic. But you also mentioned a green recovery. So I want to ask you to go a little further about how you see recovery from COVID-19 specifically. Some of the recoveries in the past, including from the 2008 financial crisis and the economic slowdown in 2015, have seen really rapid emissions growth as that recovery has taken place on the back of increased construction and industrial activity, both for jobs and for kind of an economic reheating. And I wonder if this time will be different, and if so, in what ways?
I think we hope this time will be different, but it's still too early to say whether it's different or not. But clearly, I think data shows that the coal consumption, it was to promote new urbanization and new infrastructure. So the new urbanization focus on a lot of things, including improving living standard, including improving the green urbanization layout, like building public transit lanes, which is, of course, will have a climate mitigation implication. And the new infrastructure strategy that the economic recovery strategy supports, it's mainly focusing on digitalization of the economy, which hopefully will be a little bit different from the old infrastructure development that was the priority of the last, the economic, when we are trying to deal with the economic crisis 10 years ago. So we hope it's different.
Yeah, absolutely. That seems consistent, I think, with some of your comments on the pre-pandemic economic landscape, with China really entering into many of these new sectors. I'd like to finish this portion of our discussion with what many of us would see as some of the fun stuff. So, you work directly on innovation in the environmental space. What do you see as the particularly promising pathways? We've heard about China's play to scale up hydrogen, which now has it in competition with the EU in many ways to dominate that sector. We now see Korea entering it, and to a lesser extent Japan, in very meaningful ways. China, of course, is involved in pursuing next generation nuclear, storage and batteries, global leader, improvements in more conventional, arguably, spaces, like the development of the ultra high voltage transmission lines, which could link renewables that are being produced outside, in some cases fairly long distances away from the demand centers, but can move that electricity fairly efficiently to those demand centers. Electrification of the vehicle fleet to a greater extent than already exists. I'm giving you a laundry list, but this is what you know far more about than certainly we do. So please, what gets you excited technologically and innovation-wise on where we're headed here?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. I'm not sure I'm the best position to answer the technological questions, but I think I will give you my wish list. I think EV, as you mentioned, many people already mentioned it. This is going to be huge in China. The EV, the vehicle itself, all the technology around it, and also all the infrastructure around it. And
decarbonization in 2060 in the 14th five-year plan, and in the nationally determined contribution that China submits to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, there will be a significant loss of credibility related to the 2060 carbon neutrality goal. And I think actually for President Xi Jinping himself, I think President Xi has been very vocal about multilateralism and climate change in the past several years, has taken a leadership position. And I think that's gotten attention around the world. But I think if his rhetoric and his long-term goals are not matched with short-term action, that there'll be a loss of credibility for both the Chinese government in this area and for President Xi personally. There are a number of steps that I think would send the strongest signals, and because they would be the most important substantively. And at the top of the list certainly are limits on coal. And there's really two types of limits on coal that are important. First, I think consumption limits on coal, and Chinese, the 14 5-year plans have had percentage limits on primary energy and the use of coal, and some formulation of limits that ratchet down the consumption of coal be very important. And then in addition, capacity limits for Chinese power plants. And there's already a dialogue around this, the capacity. There's been proposals to increase the existing cap of 1,100 gigawatts up to 1,300 gigawatts from some important stakeholders. Real pushback against that from others in the Chinese system. I think the world will be watching what the capacity limits are in the 14 5-year plan with respect to coal. But it doesn't stop with coal. I think there's a number of other really significant steps that can be taken. One of them is another is in renewable energy targets, and ambitious targets for renewable energy I think would send a strong signal and make a big difference. And there I particularly focus on generation as opposed to simply capacity, and making sure that there's renewable obligations for purchasing as part of the system. Let me just run down a number of other items that I think would both contribute to the quality growth that Hu Min was just talking about, which is so important, and help to hit climate targets. One of them is power sector reform. There's been important movement towards power sector reform in the past couple of years in China, but a lot more that needs to be done in order to really have, in order to help the Chinese economy reach the 2049 goal of a prosperous middle-class society. So I think it's a complex topic. There's a lot to say about it. One thing I'd particularly point to is interprovincial electricity trading, which could make a big difference in the deployment of renewables. Investment in natural gas, I think in particular in heating infrastructure in the north would make a big difference. This is a little bit controversial, could be controversial in the West. I think some Western stakeholders are opposed to any additional investment in natural gas. I think in economies like China's, investment in natural gas infrastructure over the course of the next several decades can play an important role in decarbonizing industry, and I would support it. And let me run through a few more. I think carbon capture and storage technologies are really important, and China has the opportunity to be a global leader in this area, and this is going to be a huge growing market, and the capacity to implement this technology with demonstration projects in China that's probably lacking in some other places. And that too is going to make a big difference in decarbonizing industry in China, which is so critical. Two other areas I want to highlight. One of them is electric vehicle charging and infrastructure. I think investment in that can be a big part of a green stimulus plan, and continue to position China as just the global leader in the electric vehicle market. Last year, more electric vehicles sold in China than the rest of the world combined. And then a final area that I think is incredibly important is the food system. And this gets, I think, much too little attention in the global dialogue on climate change. Let me just spend a minute on that, and then I promise I'll turn it back to you, Jackson. But so globally, the food system it generates about somewhere between 21 and 37% of all greenhouse gas emissions, according to the IPCC. That's a huge percentage. And I find in the dialogue on climate change, it just often doesn't get the attention it deserves. There are a number of measures that can be taken in order to reduce emissions from the food system. a lot of things that can be done on farms, a lot of things that can be done in the transit and transportation of food. One area that the Chinese government could lead on is food waste. And President Xi Jinping already has a very bold campaign to cut food waste. And that hasn't actually been wrapped into the climate change agenda. But I think if the Chinese government were to make this part of its NDC, part of its nationally determined contribution, and really highlight this as a climate measure, that could send a signal to other countries around the world that helping to fight food waste and address food sector emissions is a very important part of the fight against climate change. One final point on this: there was an article released in Scientific Journal within the past week that very interesting analysis, which says that if emissions from the power sector, transport sector, and industry were all cut to zero globally, but food sector emissions continued on their current business as usual path, the world would not meet the 1.5 degrees C goal. So the food sector is really important, and China is very well positioned to make a big difference in this area.
Thanks, David. I want to just maybe add a quick two-finger endorsement on two of the points that you brought up that I'm really glad that you did. One is on the nuanced but really vital difference between talking about renewables production and renewables generation, which I think is a first cousin to your endorsement of emphasizing power sector reform. When we look at curtailment rates for renewables, and that is the renewable energy that is being brought into the system but doesn't ultimately reach a consumer in China, they're enormous, often over half of the renewable production not actually ultimately reaching consumer. You mentioned interprovincial trading and power sector reform. There are some promising signs from the power sector reform pilots in China. But scaling this up is going to face some pretty substantial headwinds from business as usual approaches to guarantee purchasing agreements between coal-fired power generation and utilities, to really liberalizing the spot markets in the power sector so that you can bring on those renewables at the times when they're being generated. Warm, sunny days and windy nights, things like that, and match those up through a combination of storage and transmission to consumers. A lot of that goes back to some of the soft policies that Humin was referencing earlier, more so than technological approaches, where the infrastructure build has been quite impressive. And also really happy that you brought up agriculture, and you've actually answered one of our questions from the audience on that. I'll just add too, that because of shifts in China's overarching food policy from a real emphasis, particularly on grains, towards sovereignty, toward a move that sees them more engaged in the international food trade, they have a growing influence over those supply chains. And this also dovetails with increased protein consumption, which sees hogs and cows being fed with grain from South America, the United States, et cetera, at larger and larger scales, as well as the importation of wheat from Central Asia, Russia, of some rice from South Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia, et cetera. So the ripple effects, given China's population and overall consumption, are enormous. And any discussion I would submit about trying to make agricultural supply chains more sustainable and more climate smart really in many ways needs to begin with China, as it moves more into those markets from a history in which, again, it had been quite focused on producing much of the food domestically. Similarly, for the gas sector, which I'm glad that you brought up, there are signs that, including some of the traditional SOEs in China, are putting very strong standards in play for the importation of LNG and the kind of upstream emissions profile that LNG has. That's going to be extremely important, and it's going to shift where their supplies are coming from, because they will then be coming from those areas of LNG production that are able to meet that very steep standard, as opposed to those with a much higher emissions profile before the gas ultimately is being burned. So thank you for that. I want to move now to our final panel member, Inshas.
A lot from the wonderful insights from all the other panelists and you, and I look forward to learn more from our later on discussion with the audience. But for now, let me just provide some of my own perspective and based on my own experience. I think maybe I can provide a little more personal experience here. As you said, I grew up in China in a coal cities in Inner Mongolia. So this issue of what this carbon neutral goal means for the regions in China that rely on coal for their living is not only important for China, for the world, but I think it's a personal issue for me. Because I have my family members, friends who are still working in the coal industry. And so I deeply wonder what is the future for them. Any climate policy issue, environmental policy issue, energy policy issue, and also energy security issue for China has to be centered around coal. So if reaching the carbon neutral goal means that China would have to move away tremendously from coal, what does it need to do to avoid really a very catastrophic disaster to the people who, in those regions? So that's the question that I'm trying to understand and help to figure out. But before that, let me just give a little bit picture in terms of what I have witnessed in how the boom and buster and rebound cycle in China has done. When I grew up there, China was still under the planned economy. So there wasn't much high coal prices, not much high coal demand. So it was the economy in my hometown in Mongolia was really down, and many coal workers were not paid for a dime in months, including my dad. But then when it gets to 2000, then the Chinese economy started to boom and coal demand and prices skyrocketed. It just like almost overnight, everybody got rich. Like anyone who can dig the black gold out of the ground, like tons of money are waiting for you. And so my dad actually also achieved his lifelong dream of buying a BYD car under peer pressure. So that was a golden growth period for coal cities, coal regions in China. But then when it gets to around 2013-ish, when the air pollution problem became so severe, and I'm sure like all of you probably know that how bad the smog was in Beijing and other major cities in China. Obviously, I think it's to Chinese people that the way that the economy has been growing is not sustainable, and therefore the Chinese government start to shut down coal-fired the boilers, and coal consumption was dramatically reduced. And in my hometown, it almost like time traveled 20 years back, and so you see people were not paid, and businesses were shut down. And the only difference is that you have a devastating environment with the polluted air, polluted water, and also really damaged land. So back then, the future was like really dismal and dark. Let me just show you a really quick picture of what it was like back then. I promise you that this is just two picture of. So this is a picture that New York Times, actually a news reported on New York Times, shows my very little known hometown to even to China, but not mentioning to the world. Very, very badly polluted. But then what really gave me a light of hope after seeing the development in the past few years is that, you see this kind of scene in my hometown, that the landscape was dramatically changed. So the lake, the lake here is a new lake that the man-made lake they developed around 2014-ish, 2015-ish as part of a hydro plant developed there. And they've spent a considerable amount of effort to green the mountains that were really damaged by coal mining, relentless coal mining, so that they can actually replant trees or other agricultural products on top of the damaged coal mines. And the city is also, trying to bring more economic values to the grape industry there. So back in the old days, the grape had little to no economic value, but now they are being developed into the wining industry. So actually there are several winery that you see, just as what you see from the Napa Valley in California. So not only it's not only it helps the wine industry, but also it's building into the tourist industry. And of course, with this kind of very beautiful scenes, then the tourist industry is also booming there. And more importantly, I think as Ming has talked about, many cities and regions in China now started to develop hydrogen, and my hometown is one of them. They've already set out the short-term, mid-term, and long-term goal for how they wanted to develop the hydrogen industry as part of the upgrading to strategic emerging industry. So all of these kind of give me a hope that they are opening to trying something new, something different from coal. However, it's not. All of those are important steps toward the right direction, but obviously it's not enough, as what we see the rebound of the coal consumption and production in the last few years. So absolutely there needs to be more to be done. And now especially China has made this determination to reach carbon neutral goal. It's going to be meaning a lot for the coal industry. So they have to really plan now and act early, because this is going to be a really unprecedented issue. So let me stop there, and see, Jackson, if you have any other questions.
Well, Yinsha, you've put me in a difficult position because you've already answered my second and my third question about some promising pathways that these regions could pursue to try to shift away from coal generation. I think that this is something we've talked about. The dynamic you describe is familiar to the coal sector around the world in many ways. So we see transition challenges in places like Germany. In the future, I think we will in Poland. We certainly do here in the United States, in states like Kentucky and West Virginia, et cetera. And I think that it's often a misguided and misunderstood issue in the West in terms of China, where there is this false narrative that simply by fiat from the national authorities, China can redeploy its labor and capital away from coal to other things from a command and control perspective, and that will simply play out because it is said to be so. Certainly not the case, and certainly a lot of difficulties here. Given that you've given us such comprehensive thoughts on this topic, I just want to ask about one more thing. Do you see major population movements in China in response to the a possible inability to meet the economic and labor demands of the population that was involved in the coal sector? Do you see that dovetailing with urbanization elsewhere and a movement of people out of some of these regions?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think the inter-immigration between the remote area or the coal areas such as Inner Mongolia or Shanxi to the more developed cities in the south, that I think has happened maybe like 20 years ago, because that's where the money is and that's where the job opportunity is. So that's where a lot of people just went through that, they went south. However, I actually think that in more recent years, maybe the past 10 years, we're seeing that it's going, the direction was reversing, because you have like so much population or the immigrants to those big cities, Beijing, Guangzhou, we call it the 4 big cities. And so the living expense there was also getting so expensive, so much competition. And so I think many people actually are now thinking about going back to those like a 2nd tier or 3rd tier cities to look for also job opportunities, because there are more development opportunities in those cities that also can better can provide them the chance to use their talents. So I actually just based on my personal knowledge, I have not seen like a huge amount of people who are actually immigrant out of Inner Mongolia. And also I think, but still there is a big issue in terms of if Inner Mongolia and other coal regions is going to upgrade to this strategic emerging industry, and those industries probably will need high skill people with a higher education background. And so not necessarily if you just retrain the coal worker, mining workers, then they will be able to really take on the new role. So I think it's definitely a critical issue to make sure that those coal regions, in thinking about how to transform their industries to new industries, think about other resources, other infrastructures, either hard infrastructure or soft infrastructure, such as human resources, will have to be also developed a plan so that they can really develop this as a viable industry policy, instead of just developing a few pilot projects and that's it.
Thanks so much, Isha. I really appreciate that unique insight you've brought to our panel. We're going to shift now into the discussion segment, and we've unsurprisingly received a raft of questions about the possibility for cooperation between China and the US under the Biden administration, as well as kind of broader international dynamics. I'll highlight that the EU top leadership had high-level negotiations with China shortly before this announcement, and some would suggest that that helped prompt the announcement that would come at the UN General Assembly. And we've also heard a question about how trade intersects with many of these climate goals. So I'm going to try to put those all in one basket, and I want to begin with you, David. Before joining Columbia, you spent many years in public life and saw some of the Obama years convergence with President Xi on bilateral climate commitments, which seeded success, I would suggest, at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, as well as, we've all witnessed either from up close or afar, the rollback of many of those policies over the past 4 years with President Trump. So where do we sit now on US-China climate cooperation?
Really important question. So I'll start this way. Under President-elect Biden, there will be a 180-degree change in US climate change policy. I suspect most people in this event know that, but it's worth highlighting that the President-elect has identified climate as one of 4 issues on his transition website in the past 24 or 48 hours that he's highlighting. And so President-elect Biden, Vice President-elect Harris have repeatedly throughout the course of the campaign emphasized how they're going to take on the climate challenge and do so within, to the extent that they can. It's also worth highlighting that if there is a Republican Senate in the United States, which is, at this point, it looks probable, though not certain, that their ability to do that will be constrained, that they'll probably be unable to enact significant climate change legislation and will need to rely upon executive actions. Now, there's a lot that can be done with executive actions in the United States, but more that can be done with legislation. So there'll be a 180-degree change in US climate change policy. There will not be a 180-degree change in US China policy. I think although the Trump administration's policies have been erratic, they've been marked by a lack of strategy. So, I think famously somebody said the Trump administration has an attitude towards China, but not a strategy towards China. Still, many of the concerns that animated the Trump administration policy are shared on a broadly bipartisan basis in the United States, and including by the Biden administration. And I think there are some issues, including in particular Hong Kong, Xinjiang, human rights related issues that will be more challenging under a Biden administration. So I think that under the Biden administration, there will be a strong desire to cooperate with China on climate change, but there will be real challenges in doing that in light of the broader nature of the bilateral relationship. Now, on the topic of Chinese attitudes, I mean, one thing that I've observed, I'm interested in others' thoughts on this, is that the kind of a significant decline in the respect for the United States from China over the course of the past couple of years. I think the Chinese government looked at the 2008-2009 financial crisis and said, we're glad we didn't follow US advice. We think we've got a better system. And I think the pandemic has only strengthened the view in China that the Chinese system is the right system and the US is a declining power. And so I think the motivation on the part of the Chinese government to enter into a deal is different perhaps than it has been in previous years. That said, I think that there are real advantages for the Chinese government in entering into an agreement with the United States on climate change. And so I think there will be an attempt on the part of both governments to enter into an agreement on climate change. I think I think it's unlikely that we're going to have big head of state level agreement on climate change like we did in 2014. I think it's not out of the question, but I'd put the odds against that because I think there's a lot of rebuilding of trust that needs to happen. But I think we'll at least see movement in that direction. And just one final point on the US-China piece, I think both governments may see this as a way to help kind of stabilize the bilateral relationship, find something that they can work together on, again, in the face of all this other discord. I'll stop there. I can talk about Europe too, but I was talking for a while, so I want to give you a chance to turn to others.
Thanks, David. And certainly that search for areas where there is some convergence and there is some possibility to work from in a sea of fairly complicated issues has been to the benefit of US-Chinese climate partnership agreements in the past. Barbara, anything to add?
Well, Jackson, I have watched the US-China relationship go up and down dramatically in the 30 years that I've been working in China, but this has to be at the lowest level that I have seen. And so many of those tensions will continue, as will competition between the two countries. But I do believe that there is room for healthy competition as well as cooperation. And I'll give you some examples. For healthy competition, I would include competition to develop that next generation of currently very expensive, but potentially transformative technologies that are going to help decarbonize these hard to decarbonize sectors like industry, like shipping, like aviation. And the ones who get there first are going to have a very strong market benefit. But on cooperation, there's a tremendous potential here. Some of the things we've already talked about today, including how do you ensure a just transition for the workers in the fossil fuel industry that Inshas has discussed so ably. Yes, as you said, Jackson, that's something that every country in the world faces, including the United States. And there's been some really promising projects and successes at the state level and the city level that can be shared in both directions. So that's one area. Another one is, again, how to use that stimulus funding to help promote economic recovery. US hasn't done much in that direction. We hope that will change under a Biden administration. The Chinese government can do a lot more to use that stimulus to enhance a green recovery. So third would be parallel setting of standards and targets. For example, Chinese government is considering a ban on phasing out of internal combustion engine vehicles, and Hainan province has already announced that. So has California. If the two countries were to announce parallel but compatible targets for phasing out those dirty engines, what a signal that would send to manufacturers that this is the way that their investment should go in the future. Another example would be power sector reform. We talked about that quite a bit. This is not something unique to China. Every country, including the United States, is starting to grapple with the idea of how to make the grid more flexible, how to allow increasing penetration of renewables. There's been a lot of exchange already between the two countries, but a lot more can be done that can move both countries in that direction. That is so important. And finally, we talked a little bit about investment overseas. China's Belt and Road Initiative still focused heavily on fossil fuel infrastructure. The US hasn't done much at all in terms of supporting other countries. We hope that will change. And I do believe there's potential here for the two countries to work together to help stimulate low carbon transitions in many of the developing world.
Jackson, can I add a really quick note? Yeah, so I completely agree with what Barbara was saying. All of the points you made were great. And I just want to add on specifically about the international partnership and collaboration. I think that's really also critical in terms of helping the co-regions to transition their economy, because this is not only an issue in China, but also an issue in the US and in Europe. So having an international partnership for them, for those co-regions to communicate, to learn from each other on their lessons, their successful experience, will really help to accelerate this transition and reach the global climate change goal much faster than otherwise. And as I talked with the Chinese business owners who own coal mining plant and coke plant, they are very open to this. They deeply realize that they cannot just rely on the old business to keep going forward, because there is a signal change right from the top that this won't be the case in the future, but they don't know what other business that they should invest to. And I think that's where, if we can have the collaboration between governments, between businesses, so that they can actually work together and figure out what are better business models, partnership can help them all to move away from coal. There is a better alternative future, they will do it. Thanks.
Thanks much both to Barbara and Yingsha. This is an excellent transition, I think, to some of the other questions that we're receiving that are also international in flavor. What Barbara brings up, in particular on the BRI, and what Yingsha mentions on trying to develop models that are useful for development in other countries is really essential. And one of the difficult trends that we see as China continues to squeeze its coal sector at home, something we've been applauding, I think, justifiably in this panel, is that excess capacity, not just in coal production, but also in steel and cement, has been moving abroad to try to find places to continue to gain some returns. And this is manifested in building coal sectors where they didn't previously exist in countries like Pakistan, with Chinese financing, the presence of SOEs in the coal and energy sectors, underwriting, providing insurance, collaborating with Pakistan to develop its domestic coal reserves, et cetera. And that's not a one-off example. China is the largest financier of coal-fired power production abroad of any country in the world. Japan and Korea are follow behind and are showing signs that they might be moving away from that direction. This brings up questions that we've heard about in the chat about justice for developing countries and ensuring that we are able, through some degree of international collaboration, to not displace or leak our carbon emissions as we clean up and transition our economies domestically into other places that are at a different phase of their own development. So Human, I'd like to start with you. I know that for years you worked with Energy Foundation China and have been involved in a lot of these issues of building out green strategies broadly that are not going to be only applicable in China. And I just wonder also if you can speak to some of those forces in these environmental sectors and energy sectors that we're focused on here that relate to these outbound issues and these international issues. Thank you. Still muted.
Thank you, Jackson. Well, if I may, I actually would like to add one more point about the US-China international collaboration. I think there's one more thing is about HFC mitigation. The bilateral collaboration between the US and China around Montreal Protocol and Kigali cooling amendment will be Kigali amendment will be extremely useful.